The golden light of early evening stretched across the quiet gardens of Ravensshire Castle, painting the ancient stone paths in shades of amber. Once, these gardens had echoed with laughter during grand celebrations, but now only the soft rustling of leaves disturbed the silence. At the center of the rose garden sat Duke Alexander Ravensshire, 35 years old, staring at the fading horizon as though it held answers no physician could provide. Only 3 days earlier, the royal physician had delivered the news Alexander had feared for months. "The illness has continued to spread, Your Grace," the elderly doctor had said gently. "We've exhausted every treatment known to us. I cannot say how much time remains, only that you should spend it as you wish." Alexander had thanked her with a calm nod, but inside, something had quietly broken. For years, he had been admired as one of the kingdom's strongest noblemen. He had led his people through harsh winters, settled disputes with fairness, and rebuilt villages after devastating storms. His courage had earned respect throughout the realm, yet none of that strength could defeat the invisible illness stealing his health one day at a time. Since receiving the diagnosis months before, he had gradually withdrawn from public life. Invitations remained unanswered. Council meetings became rare. Even close friends found the castle gates politely closed. He convinced himself it was easier this way. If no one grew closer, no one would have to grieve. As the sun dipped lower, Alexander leaned back against a stone bench and closed his eyes. The fragrance of blooming roses drifted through the air, reminding him of happier years when his mother had carefully tended the gardens herself. She had always believed flowers taught an important lesson. "They bloom without asking how long they have," she used to tell him. Back then, he had never understood. Now he wished he had listened more carefully. Far beyond the castle walls, another carriage slowly climbed the winding road toward Ravensshire Estate. Inside sat Lady Isabella Ashcroft, 24 years old, arranging several neatly wrapped baskets filled with fresh bread, herbal tea, blankets, and medicine. Unlike many noble women her age, Isabella rarely attended lavish balls or competed for attention in royal society. Instead, she spent much of her time visiting orphanages, helping village schools, and bringing comfort to families who struggled through difficult seasons. People often wonder why someone born into nobility preferred muddy village roads over glittering palace floors. Her answer never changed. Kindness grows strongest where it's needed most. That morning she had learned that several elderly servants working at Ravensshire Castle had fallen ill while caring for their increasingly reclusive duke. Without hesitation, she gathered supplies and requested permission to visit. The castle steward welcomed her gratefully. "You've traveled a long way, my lady." "I only brought a few necessities," Isabella replied with a smile. "You brought far more than that." Throughout the afternoon she moved from room to room, speaking gently with cooks, maids, gardeners, and stable workers. She listened to stories many had carried silently for months. Most spoke less about themselves than about the Duke. He barely eats. He works until he's exhausted. He thinks no one notices how much pain he's hiding. He smiles only so we won't worry. Each story made Isabella's heart heavier. She had met Duke Alexander only once years ago during a royal celebration. Even then, she remembered noticing that although others admired his confidence, there had been loneliness behind his eyes. Now that loneliness had become impossible to hide. As evening settled over the estate, Isabella finished delivering the final basket of supplies. Instead of returning immediately to her carriage, she wandered toward the gardens, drawn by the sweet scent of blooming roses. The pathways were almost empty. Then she noticed someone sitting alone beneath an old oak tree. He wore a simple dark coat instead of ceremonial robes, but there was no mistaking who he was. Alexander looked up as footsteps approached. For a brief moment, surprise crossed his face. "Lady Isabella." She offered a respectful curtsy. "Your Grace." He managed a faint smile. "I wasn't expecting visitors. I wasn't expecting to find you hiding in your own garden." Alexander actually chuckled. "Hiding? Perhaps resting," she corrected playfully. "That sounds kinder." She hesitated only a moment before asking, "May I sit?" He nodded. The silence between them felt strangely comfortable. For several minutes, they simply watched the sunset together. Finally, Alexander spoke. "Everyone who visits lately tries to convince me everything will be fine. And do you believe them? No, I wouldn't either. He turned toward her, surprised. You don't offer false hope. I've never believed kindness requires pretending. Those words lingered between them. Alexander found himself speaking more honestly than he had in months. I've spent my entire life solving problems. But this, he looked toward his trembling hands. This is something I cannot fix. Isabella listened quietly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to comfort him. She simply allowed him to be heard. It was a gift he hadn't realized he needed. My greatest regret, Alexander admitted softly, isn't dying. She looked at him with gentle curiosity. It's leaving behind people who will think I stopped caring simply because I disappeared. You haven't disappeared. I've tried. You've only hidden. The words weren't harsh. They were true. Alexander laughed quietly. I suppose you're right. A breeze stirred the roses surrounding them. The fading sunlight painted everything gold. After another long silence, Alexander looked toward Isabella. You know, she waited. Whoever marries you will be lucky. It was nothing more than an honest observation, a compliment spoken from the heart. He expected her to thank him politely. Instead, Isabella smiled, warmly, genuinely. Then she answered with complete sincerity. Then she folded her hands, calmly in her lap. I accept your proposal. Alexander blinked. I'm sorry. You said, whoever marries me will be lucky. I did. I've decided I'd like that person to be you. For several seconds, the Duke simply stared at her. He searched her expression for amusement. There was none. He searched for pity. There was none of that either. Only kindness. Only quiet certainty. Finally, he managed to ask, You do realize I wasn't proposing? I know. His eyebrows lifted. But if you truly believe your time is short, Isabella continued gently, why should either of us waste it pretending life must always follow expectations? Alexander had faced generals, kings, and royal councils without losing his composure. Yet this young woman had left him completely speechless. After a long moment, he laughed. Not the polite laugh nobles use during formal dinners. A real one, deep, unrestrained. Perhaps the first genuine laugh he'd shared in months. When it faded, he looked at her with softened eyes. Do you understand what marrying me would mean? You mean marrying a man everyone believes is dying? Yes. You would become a widow sooner rather than later. Perhaps you'd spend your youth caring for someone who cannot promise you tomorrow. Isabella met his gaze without hesitation. I don't measure life by how many years someone has. She smiled once more. I measure it by how much love can fit inside those years. For the first time since hearing his diagnosis, Alexander felt something unfamiliar stir within him. Not certainty, not recovery. Hope, small, fragile, but unmistakably alive. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the hills, neither of them noticed the castle servants quietly watching from a distant balcony, whispering in astonishment. By morning, the entire estate, and soon the kingdom, would be talking about the impossible conversation that had taken place among the roses. And before another week had passed, Duke Alexander Ravensshire would make the most unexpected decision of his life. The wedding took place exactly 9 days after the conversation in the Rose Garden. There were no grand parades, no crowded cathedral filled with nobles eager to witness the union, and no extravagant celebration that lasted until dawn. At Duke Alexander Ravenshire's request, the ceremony remained quiet and deeply personal. Only a handful of trusted servants, the castle steward, the royal chaplain, and a few lifelong friends stood inside the small chapel overlooking the hills of Ravensshire. The kingdom, however, had plenty to say. Some called Lady Isabella Ashcroft foolish for marrying a man everyone believed was nearing the end of his life. Others whispered that she must be after the Duke's vast fortune. A few insisted the marriage could never last long enough to matter. Isabella ignored every rumor. She had not married Alexander because she expected a lifetime. She had married him because she believed every day of life deserved to be lived with hope rather than fear. As they exchanged simple gold rings, Alexander looked into Isabella's gentle eyes. I cannot promise you many years, he said quietly. She smiled with the same calm confidence that had first surprised him in the garden. "You've already given me today," she replied. "We'll welcome tomorrow when it arrives." For the first time in many months, Alexander stepped out of the chapel feeling lighter than when he had entered. Life inside Ravenshire Castle changed in ways no one had expected. Isabella never treated Alexander as though he were fragile. She refused to let illness become the center of their marriage. Instead, she quietly filled their days with ordinary joys. Every morning, she insisted they eat breakfast together in the sunlit dining room rather than separately in their chambers. Some mornings she baked fresh honey bread herself, laughing when the flowers somehow ended up on both of them. "You've declared war on my coat," Alexander joked one morning, brushing white flour from his sleeve. "It was your fault," Isabella answered with a grin. "You distracted the baker. I merely asked how the bread smelled so wonderful. You stole a warm loaf before breakfast. I was conducting an inspection." "Of course, Your Grace." The nearby servants exchanged amused smiles. The Duke, once known for his quiet halls and distant manners, had begun laughing almost every day. After breakfast, Isabella encouraged Alexander to walk through the castle gardens. At first, he managed only a few minutes before exhaustion forced him to rest. But each day they walked a little farther. Sometimes they paused beside the fountain where birds gathered. Other afternoons, they wandered through the rose garden where they had first spoken. Alexander found himself noticing things he had ignored for months. The scent of lavender drifting through the air, butterflies resting among flowers, and the cheerful songs of gardeners at work. One afternoon, he stopped beside an old oak tree. "I've lived here most of my life," he admitted, "and I never realized how beautiful this place truly is." Isabella looked toward the blooming fields. "Sometimes we only see beauty after we've stopped running." He nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps she was right. The castle itself seemed to awaken. Windows that had remained closed throughout the winter were open to welcome fresh air. Fresh flowers appeared in hallways. Musicians returned to the great hall during evening meals. The kitchens filled with conversation instead of silence. Even the servants stood a little taller. Mrs. Ellsworth, the elderly housekeeper who had worked at Ravenshire Castle for nearly 40 years, smiled one afternoon as she watched Isabella arranging flowers in the entrance hall. "I've never seen His Grace smile this often." Neither had anyone else. Alexander himself hardly noticed how much he had changed. He simply found that every room felt warmer when Isabella was nearby. One rainy afternoon, while exploring the castle library, Isabella discovered a locked wooden chest hidden behind several dusty shelves. The old steward recognized it immediately. "That belonged to the late Duchess Evelyn," he explained softly. "The Duke's mother?" "Yes. It hasn't been opened since her passing." Alexander found a small silver key tucked inside one of his mother's favorite books. Together they opened the chest. Inside were neatly preserved journals, letters, pressed flowers, and carefully folded maps. Isabella gently lifted the first journal. Its pages described Duchess Evelyn's daily life, her travels, and her deep love for her family. But as they continued reading, another subject appeared repeatedly: the mysterious illness. Alexander leaned closer. "My mother wrote about it." The entries described similar symptoms affecting previous members of the Ravenshire family across several generations: fatigue, recurring fevers, gradual weakness. Yet one passage caught Isabella's attention. The answer may not lie within court physicians alone. Seek the knowledge preserved where old traditions are honored. Alexander frowned. What does she mean? I'm not sure. Several pages later they found another clue. A carefully drawn symbol appeared beside the words. Never stop searching. Neither of them fully understood its meaning, but for the first time Alexander realized his illness might not be as mysterious as everyone believed. Someone before him had been searching for answers. Perhaps they had come closer than anyone knew. Encouraged by Isabella, Alexander slowly returned to his responsibilities. He resumed attending meetings with village leaders. He personally reviewed requests from farmers recovering after a difficult harvest. He reopened scholarships for children studying medicine and engineering. The people of Ravensshire welcomed their duke's return with gratitude. Everywhere he traveled, villagers noticed a difference. He listened more carefully, smiled more often, spent less time speaking, and more time understanding. Many quietly credited Isabella. She never sought praise. She simply believed kindness was contagious. Not everyone welcomed the change. Several ambitious nobles grew increasingly uncomfortable. If Alexander recovered, even partially, their hopes of influencing the duchy would disappear. During a gathering at the royal capital, whispers filled the ballroom. Lady Isabella planned this. She married him for his fortune. She's convincing him to rewrite his will. Alexander overheard every word. In the past, he would have ignored them. This time, he walked directly toward the group. The music gradually faded as conversation stopped. "I've heard enough," he said calmly. The nobles fell silent. One elderly lord cleared his throat. "We merely worry for your grace." Alexander smiled politely. "No," his voice remained steady. "You worry because my happiness was inconvenient." No one answered. He continued, "My wife married me when everyone believed I had little time left." He looked around the room. She asked for nothing. No titles, no jewels, no promises, only the chance to stand beside me. He reached for Isabella's hand. "If there is one decision I shall never regret, it is marrying Lady Isabella Ashcroft." The ballroom remained silent. Then, unexpectedly, the king himself smiled. "It seems," His Majesty said warmly, "that Ravensshire has become richer than any treasury could measure." For the first time, many nobles lowered their eyes in quiet embarrassment. Weeks passed, then months. The royal physician returned for Alexander's regular examination. He carefully listened to the duke's heartbeat, checked his breathing, reviewed every symptom. Finally, he looked up, completely puzzled. He examined his notes again. "It doesn't make sense." Alexander exchanged a glance with Isabella. "What is it?" The physician shook his head slowly. "Your illness has not disappeared." Alexander nodded. "I didn't expect it to, but it has stopped getting worse." The room fell completely still. "I've never seen this happen before," the physician admitted. "Your strength has improved. Your breathing is steadier. Even your pulse has become stronger." He closed his notebook. "I cannot explain it." After the physician departed, Alexander walked onto the castle balcony overlooking the vast green hills. The evening breeze carried the scent of roses across the estate. Isabella joined him quietly. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Alexander looked toward the same garden where everything had begun. "For months, I believed I was simply waiting for the end." He turned toward her. "But now—" A gentle smile crossed his face. "I've remembered how to look forward to tomorrow." Isabella slipped her hand into his. "Sometimes healing arrived through medicine, sometimes through time, and sometimes it began with a single person who refused to let another face life's darkest moments alone." Far below, the roses swayed gently in the evening breeze, as if quietly celebrating the hope that had taken root within Ravensshire Castle, a hope neither of them yet realized would soon lead them to the greatest discovery of all. Autumn arrived at Ravensshire Castle wrapped in shades of gold and crimson. The once quiet estate had become lively again, filled with the sound of horses in the courtyard, children laughing in the nearby village, and music drifting from the great hall during evening gatherings. For the first time in years, Duke Alexander Ravensshire no longer looked like a man waiting for life to end. Instead, he looked like a man learning how to live again. Yet Isabella never allowed herself to believe the journey was over. The royal physician's words echoed in her mind. The illness has stopped growing worse, but it has not disappeared. One crisp morning, while helping Alexander prepare for a meeting with village leaders, she noticed him pause as he reached for the door. His hand trembled. "You should sit for a moment," she said gently. "I'm all right. You don't have to pretend with me." Alexander smiled. "I suppose I don't." He admitted he had been feeling unusually tired again over the past few days. The old fear quietly returned, not as overwhelming as before, but enough to remind them that hope still required courage. Instead of giving in to despair, Isabella remembered the journals they had discovered months earlier. She carried them to the library once more. "There has to be something we missed," she whispered. Night after night, She carefully reread every page written by Alexander's late mother, Duchess Evelyn. Between descriptions of family life and pressed wildflowers tucked into the pages, one sentence kept drawing her attention. When wisdom disappears from courts, seek it where silence has protected it. Beneath the sentence was the same unfamiliar symbol they had noticed before, a circle surrounding a blooming flower. The castle steward studied the drawing for several moments before his eyes widened. "I've seen this symbol." Alexander looked up. "Where?" "Many years ago. Your mother visited an old monastery hidden beyond the Silver Hills. The monks there were known for preserving ancient medical writings that had been forgotten elsewhere. Why didn't anyone mention it before?" Isabella asked. The steward sighed. After the Duchess passed away, no one thought those journals held any importance. Alexander closed the book carefully. Perhaps Mother left them for us to find when the time was right. 2 days later, Alexander and Isabella set out with a small group of trusted companions toward the secluded monastery. The journey was peaceful, winding through forests glowing with autumn colors and quiet valleys where streams reflected the clear blue sky. After nearly a full day's travel, they reached the ancient stone monastery resting high above the hills. The elderly abbot welcomed them warmly. "I remember your mother," he said after seeing the journal. "She never stopped searching for answers." The monks carefully examined Duchess Evelyn's writings. One scholar disappeared into a vast archive lined with handwritten manuscripts that had been preserved for centuries. Hours later, he returned carrying a weathered leather-bound volume. "I believe this is what she hoped someone would someday find." Inside were detailed observations describing an inherited illness remarkably similar to Alexander's. Unlike the physicians at court, these ancient healers had documented a gradual treatment focused on specialized herbs, balanced nutrition, careful rest, and steady physical activity, rather than harsh remedies. "There is no instant cure," the scholar explained, "but many who followed this approach lived long, meaningful lives." Alexander exchanged a hopeful glance with Isabella. For the first time, they were no longer facing uncertainty alone. The following months required patience. Recovery came slowly. There were difficult days when Alexander became exhausted after only a short walk. There were mornings when old symptoms briefly returned. But each setback was followed by small victories. He could ride horseback farther than before. His appetite steadily improved. His strength gradually returned. Every improvement, no matter how small, became a quiet celebration. One snowy evening, Alexander laughed as he successfully split firewood alongside the castle workers. Mrs. Ellsworth folded her arms with satisfaction. "I haven't seen His Grace do that in years." Neither had Alexander. Life no longer felt borrowed. It felt renewed, with his health improving. Alexander began looking beyond the castle walls. "If I had been given another chance," he told Isabella one evening, "I want others to receive chances too." Together they transformed Ravensshire. The Duke funded new hospitals where every patient received care regardless of wealth. Schools expanded into villages that had never before had teachers. Libraries welcomed children eager to learn. Homes were built for widows, elderly citizens, and orphaned children. Instead of hosting lavish royal banquets, Alexander and Isabella often spent those evenings visiting the very people their projects were helping. The people loved them not because they wore crowns or titles. They loved them because they listened. Travelers from neighboring kingdoms soon began calling Ravensshire the Duchy of Hope. Nobles who had once mocked Isabella now praised her wisdom. She accepted every compliment with the same gentle smile. "The Duke made these choices," she always said. "I merely reminded him who he already was." Several years passed. The mysterious illness never completely vanished, but it no longer controlled Alexander's life. His physicians often admitted they still could not fully explain his remarkable recovery. Alexander simply smiled. "I can." They always looked puzzled. "It began the day someone gave me a reason to believe tomorrow was worth seeing." On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Alexander invited Isabella to walk to the palace gardens just before sunset. Everything looked different from the lonely evening when they had first met. The flower beds overflowed with vibrant roses. Children from the village played nearby, chasing butterflies beneath the old oak tree. The fountain sparkled in the golden light. Alexander stopped beside the same stone bench where he had once believed his life was nearly over. He turned toward Isabella. "Do you remember this place?" She laughed softly. "How could I forget? You changed my life here." She shook her head. "No, you chose to change it yourself." Alexander reached into his pocket and removed a small velvet box. Inside rested a beautifully crafted ring, its center adorned with sapphires surrounded by tiny white diamonds. "You already said yes once," he said with a warm smile. "But this time—" He gently took both of her hands. "I'd like to ask properly." Tears filled Isabella's eyes. Alexander looked at her exactly as he had years ago and repeated the words that had unknowingly changed both of their lives. "Whoever marries you will be lucky." She laughed through happy tears. "I still accept your proposal." He slipped the new ring onto her finger. Around them, the evening breeze carried the sweet fragrance of blooming roses. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood together, watching the sun slowly disappear beyond the rolling hills of Ravensshire. Alexander thought back to the lonely man who had once sat on this very bench believing his story was ending. He realized now that it had actually been the beginning. The greatest miracle had never been finding an old treatment or regaining his strength. The true miracle had been discovering someone who looked beyond illness, beyond fear, and beyond the uncertain future, to see the person still capable of giving and receiving love. Hand in hand, Alexander and Isabella continued walking through the garden as the castle bells rang softly across the valley. Their story became one told throughout the kingdom for generations, not as a tale of a dying duke, but as the story of two hearts that proved compassion could restore hope. Courage could overcome despair, and love, when offered freely, could transform even the darkest season into the beginning of a beautiful new life.